I want to thank Pat and all the consortium and board members who have made me feel so welcome here in the last 24 hours. It's been really great to be here. One of the reasons that I truly enjoy coming to events where there are a lot of people who are providing workforce and adult education to adult learners is because one of the common misperceptions is that Washington, D.C. is where innovation happens and that policymakers are developing policies that are leading the way, when actually the truth is Washington is typically about 10 years behind the field. And Washington is often trying to catch up with the innovations that you have already figured out. And I was struck by that this morning at breakfast, talking with some members of the consortium, what an important role educators play in educating policymakers about their innovations so that policy can follow best practice. So today, I want to tell you a little bit how Washington is trying to catch up with you. But just to tell you a little bit about National Skills Coalition, we are a national organization. We work at the state and federal level. We seek an America that grows its economy by investing in its people so that every worker and every industry has the skills to compete and prosper. And we pursue that vision through a mission that involves organizing. We organize coalitions in states and nationally across different stakeholder groups, employers, labor, educators, and then we advocate for public policies that are based on the expertise of our members. And we also work very hard to communicate about those policies and about those practices in a way that's really accessible and compelling to the American people so that they can be a part of a movement to increase access to education and training for all Americans. So before I tell you about what's happening in Washington with adult education policy, I'd like to start with a little history. And I apologize, I do this a lot to my audiences. I'm a bit of a history buff, but I think that we can get some good perspective on where things are in terms of the debate around education and adult learning itself in Washington and in the states with a little flashback to both recent history and more distant history. So folks probably are familiar with the legacy of the GI Bill. So when you hear about the GI Bill, what's the first word that comes to your mind? College. Yes, servicemen in college, right. And that's really the legacy that has endured for the GI Bill. It's really become quite a symbol in both American history and in education policy. What folks don't realize is that the GI Bill didn't just send people to college. The GI Bill sent people to finish their GED, to occupational training, to apprenticeships, a whole range of skill pathways. In fact, there were 2.2 million veterans who used the college and graduate school provisions of the GI Bill. 5.6 million veterans used the occupational and vocational training, the GED provisions of the GI Bill. So this is a part of the GI Bill history that we have completely forgotten. And truly what it comes down to is that the GI Bill was a cornerstone of Roosevelt's economic policy. He really saw that a variety of educational pathways were necessary to get former servicemen back into the labor market and to really grow the economy. So, traveling forward in time in our time machine, that was 1944, this is 2013. It's completely different now, right? Well, yes, in some ways things are very, very different. Technology has left no industry untouched, no occupation untouched. The skills that are needed today are very different than the skills that were needed in 1944. But the educational pathways to get those skills have not changed all that much in terms of the types of credentials that we need to make sure people in the labor force are getting. So if you look at this analysis that National Skills Coalition did, what you see is that in today's labor market, nearly half of the jobs in the country require more than a high school diploma, but not a 4-year degree, some kind of credential in between, what we call middle skill jobs. That kind of goes against the common notion that the only good jobs available in this country require a 4-year degree, and it argues for a greater diversity of educational pathways. And it's not just now that that's what the labor market looks like, it's going to look that way well into the future. Here you see the job openings between 2008 and 2018. While there's some shrinkage of middle skill jobs from 48 to 43%, they remain the largest portion of job openings for the next decade. And folks probably hear a lot about the skills gap. There's a lot of reports in the newspapers and on television about employers who can't find workers with the skills, the particular technical or other skills that they need to fill open jobs. And that's particularly distressing to hear that news when unemployment is so high. I think, again, the common assumption is that the skills gap is at the higher end of the labor market, when in fact the skills gap in the US and in nearly every state in the nation is at the middle skill level. So, more recent history. If we look at the education vision that's shaping the country right now, if we go back to 2008 when President Obama was on the campaign trail, his vision for education was one where we expect all of our children to go to college. And that vision was not that different from a lot of the other people who were on the campaign trail with him, both Republicans and Democrats. It was not that different from the previous administration. This focus on young people and ensuring access to college, to four-year degrees. That, of course, is an incredibly important mission and an incredibly important vision, but the labor market data suggests that it needs to be broadened a little bit. Fortunately, very soon after the president was elected, we saw signs that his education vision was indeed expanding. So in 2009, at his first joint address to Congress in February, he called on every American to get at least 1 year of education or training past high school. And he laid out a diversity of pathways that people could take to get there. And I can't overstate what a tremendous shift this was in the educational vision that was driving the country and policy, because we really hadn't heard this vision from anybody truly laid out this way since 1944. And we've continued to hear that vision. Policy has been a little bit slower to follow the vision, but in the 2012 State of the Union address, the president committed to training 2 million workers. And he even went as far as to note that there were 4 main pillars of his economic agenda, and that job training was one of them. Again, that's unprecedented for a president in modern history to say that anything beyond college or any other alternative pathway is an economic cornerstone. So what lies between this expanded vision for education that the president has laid out and repeated and the reality? Well, the gap between vision and reality is something that everybody here is very familiar with, because you work every day to serve the adult learners who don't have the basic literacy, numeracy, or English language skills or high school credential to respond to the president's call to action. I think folks are probably familiar with these numbers. As far as the total number of folks who can't respond to the president's call to action, various people have put out different numbers, anywhere from 88 million to 93 million people in a workforce of 150 million who cannot respond to the president's call to action because they need adult basic education. One example of this, I think about sometimes, so what if the president backed up that call to action that everybody get a year past high school, and he said, we're gonna repeat the GI Bill, we're gonna pay for everybody to get 1 year of post-secondary training. Well, Michigan offers an interesting example. In Michigan, under the Granholm administration several years ago, they started a program called No Worker Left Behind, where they guaranteed that all displaced auto workers could retrain for a new occupation at their local community college. And what they discovered was that 1/3 of the auto workers who were entitled to that benefit could not enroll at the community college because they needed basic skills remediation. So again, even if we have a great vision, even if we have the resources to get people 1 year of training past high school, we have to address this gap. And the bottom line is adult education is the missing piece. Again, something you all know very well. So one would assume that since adult education is that cornerstone to realizing this economic vision, that we would be making significant investments in adult education. Unfortunately, because of ongoing fiscal crises and moves to cut spending in DC, there has been a significant drop in support for adult education and family literacy funding in Washington. As you can see here, this is adjusted for inflation. since 2003, the last 10 years, there's been a 24% decrease in adult education funding, and it dropped even more after the sequesters this year, which I'll talk about a little bit later. And of course, when spending goes down, the number of people we can serve goes down. This was the first year that the Office of Vocational Adult Education reported that less than 2 million people were served by the Adult Education and Family Literacy Act. So the numbers continue to decline as the funding declines. And it becomes more and more challenging to envision how, if we only have the resources to serve less than 2 million people a year, how we're going to fill that gap of 93 million who need these services. So just to put it in stark relief, the number of adults without the basic skills to answer the President's call to action and the number of served each year with federal resources. Of course, there is state funding, as you know, that helps to supplement the federal investment in adult education. And those of you who were here last year, I think you had the opportunity to hear about a study that CLASP did looking at the state and local matches. And that study found that while it's commonly assumed there's a $3.50 to dollar match by states and locals, the reality is it's about $1.30 to a dollar. And in a lot of states with ongoing fiscal crises, those resources have continued to decline. And that's where you also see the extremes of investment. Here, the greatest investment is in the state of Florida, while the least state investment is in Iowa and 2 other states, although one bright spot. Iowa passed a $10.5 million new appropriation for adult basic education in the most recent General Assembly. And I think there are some folks here from Kirkwood Community College who can tell you about that. Yes, go Kirkwood. And I mean, this is truly outstanding. It's definitely against the trend. And unfortunately now I think Arizona and Colorado are in the lonely position. They've lost Iowa as their comrade in being states that don't invest. So sorry guys. But this appropriation in Iowa, it's going to support direct support to adult education, but also support to these programs like the Pathway Navigators that ensure there's linkages between adult basic education and ongoing post-secondary training or employment. So this is truly, I just brought you down tremendously with all that news about federal spending, so remember the bright spots. All right, so what is in play for adult education this year in DC? I think folks tend to think that DC is a fairly dysfunctional place, which it is, but there's actually things happening despite all that dysfunction that impact adult education, and those are funding reauthorizations. And the big one that I think is going to potentially have the biggest impact on the work you do, which is comprehensive immigration reform. So funding, the federal budget. As I said, we have a little dysfunction in Washington right now. So before I give you the bad news, we're going to do the history lesson again. So the proposals for workforce education and adult education this year that have come out are disheartening. But I think it's important to go back and look at what the sort of initial shots were for fiscal year 2012 and fiscal year 2013 funding, and then where we ended up, because that's really important to remember. So for fiscal year 2012, the House passed a budget resolution that cut $4 billion from workforce and adult education and completely eliminated the Workforce Investment Act. So that was the initial proposal. At the end, when a continuing resolution was passed to fund the government, there were only $1 billion in cuts, only, and WIA still existed. Again, in fiscal year 2013, over $2 billion in cuts were proposed, and what we ended up with was generally level funding. Now, the starting place and the ending place were not an accident. That was the result of a tremendous amount of advocacy by people in local communities who deliver these programs, who are learners in these programs, and the employers who rely on these programs. Because the problem is, a lot of the policymakers in DC, nearly all the policymakers in DC, followed an educational pathway that is the exception today in the US. They went straight through K-12, They went right on to a full-time 4-year degree. They lived on campus. They came out with relatively little debt, and they started working. What they don't understand, what they need your help understanding, is that is the exception, and that is not the experience of most of the people in your communities. And if they don't hear that from you, they legislate based on their own experience. So there was a tremendous amount of advocacy the last 2 years that got us from these starting places to these ending places. So remember that as I tell you what has been proposed in 2014. Before we go into that, that ending number that I gave you for 2013 in the continuing resolution, there was an adjustment to that. I think a lot of folks have heard a lot about sequestration. This was the result of something called the Budget Control Act, which basically said to Congress, look, you have to reduce the deficit by this amount. You have 2 options. You can decide how you want to do that strategically and come together and come up with a way to make cuts that make sense and some revenue increases. Or if you fail to do that, there's going to be automatic across-the-board cuts to what are called non-defense discretionary programs. It's a very small part of the budget, but that's where all the programs we care about sit. Congress did not come up with a strategic way to address the deficit, and so we are now facing, for the next 9 years, automatic across-the-board cuts to spending after Congress has passed a continuing resolution or appropriations. So you can see here what happened to adult education when a 5% across-the-board cut was applied. It went from $595 million to $564 million. And if folks haven't seen it already, OVE did put out on their website how that's going to come down for states individually, that cut. And it's not a flat 5% to every state, just based on the formulas. Some states are going to see more than 5%, some states will see less. One other note on fiscal year 13 funding, which we have now closed out, is that there was a policy change that took place in the process of figuring out appropriations and funding for that fiscal year. And that is that the House when they passed their budget, they eliminated eligibility under the Pell Grant for a category of folks called ability to benefit. And what that provision does is it allows folks who perhaps don't have a high school diploma or equivalent, but are prepared to do credit-bearing work, post-secondary work. It allows them to prove that they're able to do that and get a Pell Grant. This has been a really crucial eligibility guideline for folks who are running bridge programs where people are co-enrolled doing adult basic education and post-secondary education at the same time. It's been crucial to the iBest program. It's been crucial to a lot of these programs, and the elimination of that is really a big hit because these bridge programs, as it stands, it's fairly challenging to braid the federal funding streams that are needed to do this. I think folks who have tried to braid Title I and Title II under WIA know those challenges. So this is an unfortunate byproduct of the fiscal year 13 funding. And again, based on the comments that were made by legislators about this, I think it again comes from a place of not understanding the college experience of most of their constituents. So this is an area where I think folks can really play a role in educating their elected officials. Okay, so the 2014 budget. I've put off the bad news long enough. So obviously the ongoing framework is austerity, and again, Congress is legally required to meet the spending cap set out in the Budget Control Act. So what happens in the budget process in DC is the House and the Senate both put out their budget resolutions. They don't give spending levels for specific programs. They're putting out broad guidelines for how much they want groups of programs to spend. And what's supposed to happen is that they both pass their budget resolution and then they kind of reconcile those two. They come up with a joint budget resolution, and then they send that to the appropriations committees to figure out the actual spending levels for programs. That process hasn't happened in quite a few years. They have not been able to agree on a budget resolution, and the appropriations committees just start doing their work. And And then the appropriations committees are supposed to agree across the House and Senate. That hasn't worked either, and that's how we end up with these continuing resolutions. But as far as what's in the budget resolutions, both the House and the Senate have put out budget resolutions that meet the cuts required under the Budget Control Act, but they've done that in different ways. The House budget, it restores all the sequester cuts that happen to defense programs, and it takes those cuts and puts them on the non-defense programs like workforce training. So it's an extra hit to programs like adult education. It imposes, so that comes out to be an additional $1.1 trillion in cuts to these non-defense discretionary programs. And it also cites the Skills Act, which is the House-passed Workforce Investment Act reauthorization bill, which I'll talk about later, to justify additional steep cuts to education and training. The Senate budget, again, it meets the guidelines of the Budget Control Act, but it also eliminates all 9 years of sequestration, and it does that with a balance of some cuts and some revenue increases. And that budget also includes $10 billion in new workforce education and training spending. And then there's the president's budget proposal, which actually isn't really a piece of legislation, or it's not something that gets voted on. It's not something that Congress considers. What the president's budget is it's basically a roadmap and a signal from the administration of where their priorities are for the coming year and what they would like to see Congress do as they're making spending decisions. So again, the president's budget, it rolls back the sequester through a combination of revenue cuts, and it includes $16.5 billion in new mandatory education and training investments. And these mandatory investments would not be subject, because they're mandatory, to annual appropriations or sequestration. So again, some evidence that the president is trying to follow through on that expanded pathway vision that he has laid out. Just a little quick detail on what's in the president's budget. A $79 million increase for Title I WIA, level funding for Title II Adult Basic Education, and an increase to national leadership activities with a focus on the reentry education demonstration. Just some of the other programs that saw increases or level funding: Wagner-Pfizer, ex-offenders saw increases, and migrant and seasonal farm workers and Indian and Native American training programs were level funded. Same with TANF. As far as that $16.5 billion in new investments, this is basically what he's envisioning for those. These are proposals that he's put out in the past through the American Jobs Act, which did not pass, but it includes a range of educational strategies, from subsidized employment, summer youth programs, and some subsidized employment that involves on-the-job training. There's some good flexibility around these funding streams that allows them to serve a range of workers. There is a focus in a lot of this on the long-term unemployed. So the process has started to move forward. I think everyone has given up on the House and Senate reconciling their budgets, so the appropriations committees have gotten to work. In the House, the proposal that has been put out for spending levels is funding for fiscal year 14 of $450 million, which, as you can see, is significantly less than the $564 million where we ended this year. That would result in about 111,000 fewer people being served. If you look at the funding levels that have been proposed in the House appropriations legislation across all the major categories of workforce education and training, it comes to almost a $2 billion cut and 6.5 million fewer people served. So this is cutting to the bone, to say the least. The Senate has not yet put out their proposals. Their timeline is June and early July. Generally, what we have seen the last few years is that the Senate does not cut as deep as the House, and where we end up at the year, depending on how much members of Congress hear from the field, will be somewhere in between the House and Senate, hopefully closer to what the Senate puts out. So as far as when it's important to weigh in with your members of Congress about what you're doing in your programs and why they're important, it's likely that there will be a continuing resolution that funds the government through the end of the year, starting in September. That's the end of the government's fiscal year, and so they have to pass something to keep the government open. So between now and then is a really important time. In October and November, we will hit the debt ceiling again, which is what has caused all these ongoing sort of fiscal crises and grand negotiations. So it's likely that that's going to force another sort of grand bargain. And then in January 14, the FY14 sequesters legally kick in if Congress does not reduce according to the Budget Control Act. So that's the good news. Actually, there's some better news. So the other thing that's moving this year, hopefully, is reauthorization of the Workforce Investment Act. So I'm from Chicago, and I always say that being a Cubs fan is the best training for being a WIA advocate. Because it's always going to be next year, and we always believe it. So we've been saying that for 10 years, and maybe this will be the year. So basically what we're working with in WIA reauthorization in both the House and the Senate, because of the overarching fiscal climate, is a consolidation framework. I would like to say no programs will be eliminated in WIA reauthorization. That's just not the case. The question is how those programs will be eliminated, how those programs will be selected, and if it will be done in a thoughtful and constructive way or just smashed together. So we have yet to see how that's going to work. The House did pass a Workforce Investment Act reauthorization bill, the Skills Act, which they passed on March 15th. It consolidates about $9 billion worth of programs, 35 programs, into a single block grant to states, and that's a $6 billion block grant. So about a 30% funding cut across these 35 programs, and they all get put into a block grant. And as I mentioned earlier, because the Skills Act was passed, it was used by the House Budget Committee to justify, and the Appropriations Committee, deep cuts to workforce education programs. This bill was not written in a bipartisan fashion. In fact, the House Democrats on the committee walked out of the markup before the vote because they felt like they had not been engaged in the process. So it was a pretty divisive experience, I think, for the folks involved. One thing to note about the consolidation of those 35 programs is that there's now no guarantee that any particular population will get served. One important note, adult basic education is not included in those 35 programs that are being consolidated, but there are a number of programs that are very important to serving adults with low basic skills that did get consolidated. And so it's going to be at the discretion of the states to decide which populations they want to prioritize. The Skills Act also eliminated the mandate for local workforce investment boards to prioritize low income. So that is gone as well. In the Senate, it is under construction. We have been told that it's a bipartisan effort, that both sides of the committee are working together, which is promising for a more constructive process. They have said that there will be program elimination, but they're taking a measured and evidence-based approach, so we will see what that means. There's going to be a hearing next week, a subject matter hearing, and then they hope to introduce, mark it up, and vote it out of committee in July. The other reauthorization that's significant to serving adults with low basic skills is TANF reauthorization, which has been due since 2010. What's significant about this is not that reauthorization is going to happen this year, because it's probably not. But last summer, the Department of Health and Human Services announced the availability of waivers to states who wanted to develop career pathway models to move folks who need adult basic education into career path employment or post-secondary education, and that states would get a waiver of the work requirements under TANF to do this, although they would still have to meet the intent of TANF. So really, HHS was looking at this as a potential way to support bridge programs, blended ESL and ADE models with post-secondary or occupational training. In March, the House voted to block those waivers. They basically said that the president was trying to dismantle welfare reform and voted to block those waivers. The Senate is not going to take that up, so it's unlikely they will be blocked. However, the GAO reported recently that only 8 states have expressed an interest in these waivers, and so far, no states have applied for them. So I think if the administration is going to go to bat for these waivers, more states will have to express an interest. So that's what's happening with TANF. So the last thing I want to talk about today is comprehensive immigration reform and why it has a huge significance for the adult basic education community. This is the Gang of 8, the 4 Republican and 4 Democratic senators who have been working out a proposal for comprehensive immigration reform in the Senate. What's significant about the bill this year, and particularly the bill that the Senate put out, is that it truly shifts immigration and the basis for the admission of lawful permanent residents from a family-based system to an employment-based system. So this is data that was put out by the New York Times. Basically, under the current system, about 75% of admissions annually are family-based. That's going to shift to about 50-50. And because of that, it truly does make this one of the most significant pieces of employment legislation that the country has had in quite a while. So what are the benchmarks within comprehensive immigration reform that impact you? The bill lays out a pathway to citizenship, a 13-year pathway. After satisfying a number of requirements, such as back taxes and other items, individual can obtain registered provisional status. At year 6, in order to renew that status, the individual has to demonstrate continuous employment, no more than 60 days unemployed, or they can be engaged, if there's a lapse in that employment, they can be engaged in full-time education and training, and they have to demonstrate that they are earning consistently during that time 100% of poverty. At the 10-year mark, those individuals will have an opportunity to adjust to lawful permanent resident. At that point, again, the continuous employment benchmark is in place, full-time education and training, and they have to prove that they've been earning 125% of poverty. At that point, individuals will need to either meet the civics English language requirement required for citizenship or show that they are enrolled in a program that will help them get there. I threw those little asterisks in because I didn't have time to change this slide, but yesterday Senator Rubio introduced an amendment, and in all likelihood it will be adopted because it's coming from a member of the Gang of 8. The amendment says that it's no longer satisfactory to be enrolled in a civic CL program. Individuals to adjust from RPI to lawful permanent resident at that point will have to be able to pass the citizenship requirements for English language and civics. So, as far as the education and training provisions in the bill, so going back to that broader vision, this is where we see some good news. And that is that broader vision seems to be coming into play in the bill's definition of education and training. So the allowable education and training that folks can be engaged in to meet that requirement: secondary, post-secondary, GED programs, and also this list of programs, including education, literacy, or career training programs. So that is a very, very positive sign about sort of expanded vision of what educational pathways folks who are on the pathway to citizenship might need. So what do these benchmarks mean in terms of what kind of demand this will put on the adult basic education system? So as far as the income provision, the requirement to be at 100% of poverty at the 6-year and 125% at the 10-year, currently there are about 3 million of the 9 million adults who are likely eligible for the pathway to citizenship who are making less than 100% of poverty. So it's really going to be essential that there's opportunities for people to get on a path to higher wages, either through occupational training or employment services. So that's about 3 million folks who are going to need some support to do that. As far as English proficiency of the adult population of those who are eligible to get on the pathway to citizenship, about close to 7 million have limited English proficiency. And of those with limited English proficiency, about 2 million do not speak English at all. So again, if you think about, we're serving 2 million people under the current Adult Education and Family Literacy Act, just the folks who aren't speaking English at all is another 2 million. So we're going to need additional resources in the system to meet that demand and grow capacity. So if you look at sort of the demands within the bill and the education and employment status of the folks who it applies to, it definitely signals that there needs to be a skills strategy within comprehensive immigration reform. So there are some provisions in the bill to support these mandates. Likely not enough, but there are some. The first is an integration fund, and this fund is for a range of activities that are needed to help folks who are on the pathway to citizenship fully integrate into their communities. So it's $500 million over 5 years, $100 million a year for 2 grant programs, and civics-based ESL and programs that move people into the workforce and training are allowable uses of those funds, but again, it's for a whole range of activities, not just those. The CIR Trust Fund, the Comprehensive Immigration Reform Trust Fund, this is a big pot of money with all the fees and fines that are going to be collected in the process of immigration reform. It's a great big fund. The primary purpose of it is border security. The way the legislation is written, once the border is secured, if there is money available, 50 million of this fund over 5 years, so $10 million a year, could be used. It's an allowable use of funds to support competitive grants that provide assistance, and one of the allowable activities is civics ESL. And finally, there is one other funding stream within comprehensive immigration reform that can support skills training, though likely not for the populations that we are concerned about today who need that basic skills education. There's currently, under the current immigration system, there's $125 million the DOL gets every year from H-1B visa fees. These are the visas that go to sort of the high-skilled, bring in high-skilled workers. DOL is allowed to use that money to train citizens in the US for these specific occupations that those H-1B visas were used for. So typically, those are pretty high-skilled populations. The people who are benefiting from that training are maybe accredited to away from becoming a computer scientist or some other career like that. The increased cap that's in the bill on H-1B visas, it could actually increase the amount of revenue that is drawn down from those visas to up to $1 billion. So I think there are some discussions about whether or not that money could potentially be leveraged not only to train folks, but to train folks for maybe a little bit broader definition, maybe train people for the industries, jobs within an industry that are drawing down H-1B visas, or regions that are drawing down H-1B visas, so the training can support folks who maybe are a little bit lower on the skill ladder or pathway. One thing in the original legislation, all of the H-1B visa money was taken away from DOL and put into that big comprehensive immigration fund for border security. So our understanding is the White House got it back out when they did the committee amendments, and that money is still available for training. So what is the likelihood that this is all going to happen? Senator Reid wants to have this done in the Senate by the 4th of July, and his goal is to have 70 votes for the bill out of the 100 senators so that it is a sort of political pile driver that can make its way through the House. He needs at least 60 for it to be filibuster proof. And so this week, the amendments are being introduced. The Gang of Eight is working very closely together to try to control any breakdowns in the coalition, so we will see what happens. The House bill, it's facing a number of challenges. Folks may have heard their Gang of Eight just lost one of their gang members, so they're now a Gang of Seven. So again, the House seems to be having a little more trouble than the Senate in working together. But the bill itself, if it does move through, it's being fairly tightly controlled. The good news about the language in the bill around integration is that it's written in a fairly loose way. There's not a lot of clarity on allowable use. I mean, it just allows for a lot of flexibility. And so I think the opportunity for advocacy will be in the implementation phase once the bill is passed. I think there's going to be a lot of opportunities to shape how some of those integration funds are used. So there's a lot in play in DC right now. You wouldn't know it from watching the news, but there's a lot going on. And it's really important that the folks who are making these decisions in DC, as I said, they're 10 years behind where you are, and they need to hear from you about the necessity to expand their education vision and what a fundamental role adult education plays in allowing so many of their constituents to be a part of an educational pathway that is essential to the economy. So to do that, it's really important to be visible and share your stories. We'll talk a little bit about some ways to do that in my workshop after this. I know that folks have gotten some opportunities to share their stories here at CASAS through the storytelling video opportunity, and it's just great to get in the habit of telling your success stories. One place you can do that, share your stories through any associations you're a part of. A lot of them are collecting stories. But if you have a story you want to tell, you can go to our website. On the homepage, you'll see a map that you click on. These are the stories we've collected so far. There's a survey you can fill out just talking about the work you do. These stories have been really helpful as we've been meeting with members of Congress and talking to the press, because the press in particular needs to be able to put a face on these issues. So anything you can do is helpful. So that's what's happening in Washington, D.C. I hope I haven't brought you down too much. I do think, the positive thing here is that the people in this room are the ones who have the opportunity. I know you educate a lot of people every day. There's one more group of people you're going to have to educate, and that's Congress. So thank you very much, and if there's any questions.